Harvey Mansfield has been a professor of political philosophy at Harvard for over 6 decades. He retired from the classroom in 2023 at age 91. However, he's not finished thinking and writing about his favorite subject, democracy and how it works. In the Wall Street Journal of September 7th, 2024, Professor Mansfield wrote an essay with this opening, quote, "The Supreme Court case of Trump versus U.S. was about more than special counsel Jack Smith's prosecution of Donald Trump, which continues under a superseding indictment handed up by a federal grand jury in Washington. The decision and the dissents contain a fundamental debate about the presidency that looks beyond the present personalities and campaign," unquote.
Do you know any social studies, media, or literature teachers in grades 6 through 12? Encourage them to participate in CSPAN Student Cam video documentary competition. With the upcoming November election, we're asking young people to address the theme, Your Message to the President. What issue is most important to you or your community? $100,000 in cash prizes will be awarded to students and teachers. To learn more, go to studentcam.org.
Professor Harvey Mansfield, when you retired last year from Harvard as a teacher, the Harvard Crimson interviewed you, and this is a quote I want you to talk about. You said, "I voted for Trump with many misgivings, and then January the 6th, when he encouraged that insurrection against Congress, I crossed him off my list entirely." Give us the background on that.
Well, it seemed to me that January 6th was an incitement to a riot, to take over the Capitol for the purpose of falsely declaring that Trump had won the election. And that seemed to me to be a strong disqualification. Since then, events have occurred. Trump was impeached, and he was not convicted. And he's returned and made himself the master of the Republican Party. And the situation has changed. So I'm a little uncertain as to what I'll do now. I will say this, that I'll decide between the two candidates on the question of foreign policy.
Well, the reason I bring it up, before we get into the piece that you wrote in the Wall Street Journal about the Supreme Court case on immunity, was it in your early years you were an Adlai Stevenson fan?
That's very early, as an undergraduate. That's true.
So how do you get in your own mind, because you're a professor of philosophy, from Adlai Stevenson to I think you voted, you said in 2016 for Mike Pence, you didn't vote for Trump, and then you voted for Trump in 2020, and now you're perplexed. Give us your thinking on
that. Well, I came from a family of a political scientist, my father and mother, who were both strong New Deal Democrats. And so I grew up as a liberal, and that lasted for a while, all the way through my 4 years at Harvard as an undergraduate. And but when I got out, I began to see what I thought was the truth, that the Democrats were soft on communism. That was a statement often made in those days. And I agreed with that, and I began then to turn into a Republican, and began to agree with Republicans on domestic issues as well as foreign. And so I haven't really voted for a Democrat since Adlai Stevenson, a Princeton graduate. I should have known something was wrong about that.
How many years did you teach at Harvard?
61. 61 if you don't, as a professor. If you count also a teaching fellow, then it's a few more. But yeah, I was, that's just how long I taught. I don't know whether I was the oldest, whether that sets a record for a Harvard professor. Probably somebody's beaten me out, but it will be close to a record.
The piece that you wrote, it was in the July 7th Wall Street Journal, had for a layman like me, you touched about every base that I would think I would have gotten in a college class, from Plato to Democracy in America to the Federalist Papers. I can go on. But I want to back up and ask you, it was on immunity, and I want to ask you, what led to you wanting to write this piece?
Well, that's one of my specialties, executive power. And one of the oldest questions in political philosophy is the nature of the rule of law. So Aristotle asks the question, which is better, the rule of the best man or the rule of the best laws? And you can make an argument for each, and he did that. And so that has remained a contested issue. So this very profound topic in political philosophy, plus my own personal interest in executive power, I wrote a book called Taming the Prince, which examines the nature and discovery of executive power. It's interesting that Plato and Aristotle and the ancients did not speak of an executive power. That is something new. Came to us via Machiavelli, who used the word esecuzione, execution, in many senses, but especially in an ambivalent sense. Execution can mean carry out. You execute, as they say in the NFL, that you execute a play, you do it well, or it can mean cutting off your head. And so that's a strong sense of executive. The weak sense means you are carrying out someone else's will. And you're carrying out the will of Congress or the will of the electorate or the will of God. You are just a subordinate. Somebody else is the principal. You are the agent. But then, if it turns out that in order to do this, to do your job as an agent, you encounter resistance. And it turns out that it's not enough to say, pretty please. Pretty please, will you obey the law? That isn't what a cop says when he stops you for speeding. So a certain sternness, a certain attention to possible resistance has to be in the equipment of an executive. And that means that an executive might have to do acts of violence even to control violence. So on the one hand, he's very strong. On the other hand, he's quite weak. He's just doing, after all, you elect the cop to stop you for speeding. If you complain and say to the cop, I voted for you, for your salary, why are you bothering me? And he'll just say, you voted for me to do what I've done to you. So that's a feature of self-government. I am a mere executive. I'm doing what you asked me to do. So
what was your reaction when the Supreme Court's 6-3 decision came down on immunity? What was your first reaction when you saw it?
It was a good thing. I think politically it was difficult for the court to contemplate the possibility of extensive prosecutions of former presidents for acts that they had done while in office, and that this had never been done before. And it's having been done for President Trump, I think it's not so much that they wanted to defend him, but to look ahead to see that this might become a dangerous innovation in our politics. It's in the history of republics that they've suffered from accusations that the government, especially in republics, where the people are supposed to be in charge and the government is supposed to be accountable to the people, that the government would suffer from accusations of or kind of blackmail. This happened in the Greek cities, where sycophants would blackmail essentially government officials for private acts or public acts that they disapproved of. So this precedent and the prosecution of Trump might set a very bad example for the future, and I think that's I appreciated that. That the word weaponized has come to be used for this. That the Constitution is meant to be a presiding structure and based on impartial principles and not at the beck and call of a particular party. I think the present court is trying to restore that understanding and definition of the Constitution. That it shouldn't be used for in this case manifestly partisan accusations against President Trump, and I say that not being an advocate or admirer of that fellow.
So how does that track with your statement that you crossed him off the list entirely and that you think this is a good decision? And then should a president ever, if he's found responsible for January the 6th, should he be punished?
The attempt was already made and the impeachment failed. So I think that in accordance with the spirit of the Constitution, by the way, does mention the possibility of prosecution in addition to impeachment. And it is also mentioned and discussed in the Federalist. But I think what happened here was that the court decided to understand prosecution in the spirit of impeachment. The spirit of impeachment is different from a legal prosecution because a court is one thing where everybody's quiet and nobody's allowed to be partisan, where there are rules of evidence. You don't pay any attention to public opinion or what's being said in the polls or anything. Whereas impeachment is a political act. It's not done by judges, but by the Senate, the House and the Senate. But the Senate takes 2/3 to convict. Now, in present circumstances, a 2/3 vote in the Senate requires really that both parties agree to it. So that the spirit of impeachment seems to be that since partisan passions will necessarily be in play, then a president shouldn't be convicted through impeachment for acts which are solely partisan. But both parties, including his own party, have to turn against him. And this is what happened in the case of President Nixon, who was not impeached, but almost was. He resigned before he was impeached. There's never been a successful impeachment. But it's a force. It's a reminder that it's possible to commit a crime that goes beyond your the disapproval of the opposing party, and that your own party would come to reject you. So that's the idea of impeachment. And also then there's you can't go to jail. You can only get thrown out of office. So the president has been elected by the people, by a majority of the people, in our usual process with the Electoral College and so on. So that fact deserves a lot of weight. And as to entirely rejecting it, President Trump, circumstances have changed.
In your piece, you say judicial neutrality is hard to get and unconvincing if gotten. And I want to apply that to the 6-3 decision. You had 6 people who were appointed by a Republican president, 3 by a Democratic president. Why do you think both sides ended up where they are, and how much politics was there in that decision?
A good deal of politics, but a kind of long-term politics. The Democrats, the 3 Democrats, really took a position, what I call the old Republican view, that the worst thing that can happen to a republic is to fall under a king. The republic is defined as against king because by being holding power in many hands rather than one pair of hands. And so it's safer that way. And that's kind of fundamental principle of republicanism. And I think what our Constitution did was to modify that, was to create a republic with a strong executive that had and that executive was a single person who was elected independently of the legislature, so not an agent or a subordinate of it, and that this was a way to create a separation of powers in which each power was, in its way, equal to the others. Not all powers, all 3 powers have the means to defend themselves from domination by the other powers. So this was a way of keeping the executive in his box, but still defensible within it. And the Democrats on the Supreme Court were harking back to an older view that prevailed in Republican thinking, at small r Republican thinking in the 17th century, which said that the main point of a republic is that many people hold power and not one. So they, in the 17th century, it was Locke and Montesquieu later on in the 18th century who sort of founded the notion of a republic with a strong executive. Locke even used the word prerogative, that the executive should have a king's prerogative. And that's a kind of Tory word that the king, during the English Civil War, claimed to rule by his own prerogative. And the American Constitution doesn't use that word because it has such a royal sound to it. But it does, in fact, do much of the same thing. And the argument for it is presented in the Federalist, where one should always go first if you want to understand any constitutional question. Doesn't answer it completely, but that's where you should go first. And there in the Federalist, you see this famous phrase, energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government. So energy. The trouble with a committee as executive is that it lacks energy. This is the kind of executive that America suffered under during the American Revolution, in which caused such trouble for George Washington as general. So with that experience, and despite the fact that Americans were rebelling against King George, against a monarch, they ended up with a constitution that has this important monarchical feature of a single person who is an executive. He doesn't get it by inheritance; he gets it through being elected. But it's a feature not only of our Constitution, but I think, and this is a special point I think one could make about our democracy, is just the almost universal, the pervasive character of one-person rule. The fact that so many of our institutions are found to work better when run by one person. And this applies to newspapers, as I was saying, but also to universities and to corporations. Any association, almost any association, seems to work better with a single executive on top. One of the problems with the family is that doesn't exist there, or it's contested, put it that way. But all these associations require energy, and therefore a single executive, and therefore a strong executive.
What would your colleagues, your fellow professors at Harvard, think of your statement about one person is better running an institution rather than committees? And because, as you know, academia has committee after committee after committee to choose anything.
Yeah. Well, each of them has a chair. The government department in Harvard has a chair. He's not actually elected, but chosen by the administration. So, or she. So that yes, it's true, and that can be a person who has very limited power or contested power, say like Speaker Mike Johnson. He's a single person, but he's got a lot of contrary voices in his very close majority.
When I interviewed you 24 years ago on your book, Democracy in America, that you translated with your deceased wife, I asked you, how many conservative professors are there on Harvard's campus? And you were one of them. And your answer was 6. In the last 24 years, has that number changed?
Yeah, now it's 5.
What's
and sure enough, they're not replacing me with a conservative, so it's interesting.
Why is that?
Yeah, hard to say. Well, maybe conservatives are not as intelligent. I don't think that's the case, so try something else. Conservatives prefer business to academia, and maybe that's true. You're not surprised if a stockbroker is a Republican. Why should you be surprised if your professor is a Democrat? But then that there should be so few altogether, I think smacks of a movement, partly unconscious and partly conscious, within universities toward uniformity of opinion. And I think some of the blame of this goes to affirmative action. Partly, well, if you're a professor and you're in your department and you want to be tolerant of the other side, you will use that desire to be tolerant to promote somebody who deserves it, like an underrepresented minority, or a woman, since women have only now come to be so equalized in universities. So you would use it to do that rather than to give it to a conservative. And here's where I think the most important point is this, that to be a liberal is to concern yourself above all with the community in which everyone is included. They love this word, inclusive. And that means that you're especially interested in those who might not be included, and those people are on the margin. So it's bad to be excluded, and it's bad to be marginalized. People who are excluded and marginalized are vulnerable. So if your main concern is to include everybody, you focus on the vulnerable. And as for the vulnerable, you define them as people that you feel sorry for. A liberal is a person who makes a lifelong search for people to be sorry for. And liberals are not sorry for conservatives. That, I think, is fundamental point. And so they confine their toleration or their praise or preference for the underdog to those they can feel sorry for. As a conservative, you're very much an underdog in university these days, and that actually is, if you're a student, that's actually not so bad, because it leads you to take a more critical attitude and to think whether everything that your professor says is a golden truth. So I like to say then that that conservative students get a better education, but the faculties suffer, and I think that's what's happened at Harvard and really almost all American universities. That they've suffered because they're cocoons.
I want to get back to the subject of Donald Trump in this way. You've had a lot of well-known students in your class over the years. I want to pick two. And they, at one point, were Republicans. Now one of them isn't. That's Bill Kristol. The other one is Tom Cotton, senator from Arkansas. And I'm not sure there's an answer to this, but I'd be interested in your take. You had them in class. They both are now very visible. One is very anti-Trump. One is very pro-Trump. And did you have any influence on them? How do people who think they're conservative get to the same position or the different positions that they do over this one man?
Well, look, Trump sets a problem for everybody, or for every conservative or Republican, as you can see in my own case. But I like to treat my former students like a mother hen. And so I take care of all my chicks, and they do go all the way from never Trumpers like Bill Kristol to I wouldn't call Tom Cotton a Trumpista. Maybe Charles Kessler, somebody the people at Claremont are a little closer to liking for Trump, but Tom Cotton has had to embrace Trump. Those are his voters. See, that's the problem with Trump. It's not so much Trump as people who vote for him. And the Trump voters are the most and more interesting, I think, than Trump himself. Trump is just a demagogue, a kind of fellow that is a danger in every republic or every democracy. Who just has a personal desire to be loved by anybody, and is willing to use any kind of means to succeed in that. So, but a Democrat is I think is always open to that threat, or a democracy is open to that threat.
You've lived most of your life in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at where Harvard's located. Massachusetts itself is almost always a liberal state, not necessarily Republican, Democrat, but the Trump supporters are mostly outside of the Northeast. What's your take on why they support Donald Trump? What is it they don't like about what? What are they angry about?
You mean in the Northeast, or
no, in the rest of the country?
The rest of the country. Well, the most obvious enemy in any democracy is an elite. So democracy has a kind of bad love affair with an elite. Elite means chosen, the chosen, and you choose by election. So the elite seems to be people that you like, that you've elected. But somehow, when they get into government, they do things that displease you, like the cop who stops you when you're speeding. And so you take up against the very person which you've elected, now calling him, instead of elected, elite, and or even instead of that, established, as if established meant inherited or got by some undemocratic means. So democracy dislikes, but isn't necessarily ruled by elites, and that so the elitism is perhaps the most common charge by which you can get elected, so that you can then suffer by going to Washington and joining the elite.
You say in your July 7th piece in the Wall Street Journal that Abraham Lincoln is our best president. Why?
He saved the country. So I think we have two, in the list of great presidents that historians make, I differ because I think we only have two that are right at the top, and everybody else is beneath them. And that's because those two are nonpartisan and appeal to both parties, the father of our country and the savior of our country. So that's George Washington. So a couple of people wrote me emails about my article and say, why, it isn't Lincoln, it's Washington. All right, but at least those two, I think, are in the competition. See, the father of our country, he put together the Constitutional Convention. He held us together. That's kind of a kingly feature. And everybody praises him because he wasn't a king, but he did many of the offices of an intelligent king. And Lincoln came along with and solved our greatest problem, or began to solve it, which was slavery. And so And slavery was an instance of majority tyranny. The great thing about the American founders and framers is that they were concerned not so much with the opposite of a republic, but with the weaknesses of a republic. Everybody here wanted a republic. So instead of spending their time or wasting their time denouncing monarchy, they said, we have to look to the weaknesses of a republic, or today, the weaknesses of a democracy. And the main weakness that they worked against was majority tyranny. And we had a majority tyranny in 1860 in the South of whites over blacks who were held as slaves. So, and it looked as if it was a democracy, because the Southerners considered themselves a democracy. That was majority rule, and these other fellows with color in their complexions were inferior, so they didn't deserve to vote. But we, as far as whites were concerned, were a majority. So, in other words, slavery was, or at least had the semblance of a majority convention. So, so really, what Lincoln had to do was to show that the majority tyranny was wrong, and that meant opposing and finally fighting the rebels in the South. He was able to identify them as rebels to the Union. So the war was fought to save the Union, not simply to abolish slavery. But it turned out that saving the Union meant abolishing slavery. So that was Lincoln's great political triumph. He found an issue that the North was willing to fight for. Okay? There were a lot of people who were against slavery in the North, but they weren't willing to give their lives to abolish it. And Lincoln arranged things. And I think this is his greatest triumph, and why I would put him slightly above Washington. Arranged things so that the slavery question was solved through the Union question.
When you were in the classroom teaching, what subject did you enjoy teaching the most? What, in any particular individual? And when did you see your students light up and be interested?
My favorite course was the course I gave on ancient and medieval political philosophy, and that meant especially on Plato and Aristotle. And I think, the two, maybe Plato's Republic. I think I spent about 3-4 weeks explaining the issues in Plato's Republic. I think that lights up most students, and in a way, that's the greatest book, I would say, written by a human being, rival to the Bible. It's those would be the two two choices two books to choose from. But yeah, I would give us that specific answer. Teaching Plato's Republic.
When I saw you mentioned Plato, I looked up some of the things that he said and wrote them down, and I'm going to ask you to react to them.
Yeah.
I tend to want to start with love is a serious mental disease and ask you, what was that all about?
Love. Well, in the Republic, love gets in the way of justice. And because when you fall in love, I obviously become Um, you choose that person or even that principle which you think you need the most, or which attracts you the most, and that can easily make you unjust. So, like a parent who loves one child more than another, and justice would require treating them equally. So in Plato's Republic, Socrates sort of takes up against the influence of love.
But quickly, the three, Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, what was their ages? How much did they know each other? When did they live?
This was the fourth century, 5th and 4th century BC in Athens. Socrates was the oldest of the three. Plato was one of his students, and wrote the Apology, which is a defense of that's the old Greek sense of apology. It means that you're defending something. He defended Socrates, who was, put to death by the Athenians for corrupting the youth and violating the religion. So that was Plato, a student of Socrates, and then Aristotle was a student of Plato for 20 years, and he disagreed with him. There's a famous phrase in which he says, "I love the truth more than my friend." He made that apology for disagreeing with Plato on a certain point at the beginning of his Ethics. So those would be those three persons.
I have a couple more Plato quotes for you. I am the wisest man alive, for I know one thing, and that is that I know nothing.
Yeah, that's in Plato's Apology. And he knows nothing because he's a philosopher. He loves philosophy means that you love the truth. Philo, your friend, or you love the truth, Sophia. So if you love something, that means you don't have it. It's not part of you. And that means that a philosopher is a seeker. He's a seeker of truth more than a discoverer of truth. Of course, on the way to seeking the truth, you learn certain things, you clarify certain things, you might eliminate certain fallacies. But on the whole, you're still impressed with what you don't know. Not because you're going to stop trying to learn it, but because that's it's sometimes very hard to conclude that one is better. For example, which is better, Plato or Aristotle? And so that's a much disputed question. And people resolve it sometimes by temperament more than through argument. So, but
Do you have a favorite?
I sort of go with Aristotle because he's closer to practice, and he stands for moderation and the middle class. What is not necessarily true, but for the most part true. That's a lovely Aristotelian phrase that he ends the politics with, for the most part. It isn't certain. but it's for the most part true. And so he likes to say things that are for the most part true.
I have a couple more Plato. I don't have any Aristotle, but it does help get your views on this stuff. Plato said the measure of a man is what he does with power.
Well, yes. If that means it's if that the real test is not so much how you suffer or surviving a bad situation, but how you deal with good fortune. That being lucky, having something wonderful happen to you, is in a way more dangerous than being unlucky. Because you have more choice. If you're unlucky, you fall into certain necessities. You have to do this or that. But if you have good fortune, it's more a test of your character. You've suddenly won a lottery. You become very, very rich after being, say, fairly poor. What kind of person will you be? That would be a measure of that. That's, in other words, a certain amount of power that you've got, meaning a certain greater range of choice.
After 60 years plus of teaching, what happened to the quality of student?
At Harvard, they're still pretty good. I don't.
What is there, a 2%?
It's often said, and I think it's true, that the reason to go to Harvard is not the faculty; it's the other students. And then Harvard has this wonderful yield meaning that of the offers of admission that it sends out to students, it has a higher percentage who accept. So we still do well against our main rivals in that regards. And of course, it means that the admissions committee has to be intelligent and, well, maybe fortunate too. But the students are still excellent. And so the students which I saw in my course over those 60 years, they differed a lot, say, in race or sex, but not so much in character or quality.
You can correct me.
I was never a real popular teacher, so but I often got good students.
Why were you not a popular teacher?
A hard grader. I was known as Harvey C- Mansfield, C being my middle initial. A certain lack of compassion. And one of my great lost causes, I specialize in lost causes, throughout my teaching career was combating grade inflation. And this meant that, so I got a reputation as a hard grader. And that kind of reputation will always hold down the number of students that you get in your class. It's not possible to have a very large class without having a fairly easy grading policy.
But do grades matter at a place like Harvard, where you take 2% of the people that apply, and do they ever flunk out?
They don't. No, it's very hard to get into Harvard, but it's very hard. Not so hard once you're there. That's another popular statement. I think that's true as well. Yeah. So because of grade inflation, when I arrived as a freshman in 1949, I remember the first paper that I wrote, I got a C in. This was a new experience for me. I never had a C in my life. And here I was in the major league. You see, you're in college, you're in the major leagues, you're not in high school anymore, and you shouldn't get the same grades that you got in high school. But unfortunately, that policy or that attitude has not survived at Harvard, and for various reasons, mostly through the same things that have made us conformist liberals. We've not held to strict academic standards.
Back to Plato, he said, good people do not need laws to tell them to act responsibly, while bad people will find a way around the laws.
Well, that I'm not sure where that is, but but yeah, all right. Bad people if they're clever enough. So,
but I mean, we see presidents.
See that when you think of Plato, you think of Socrates, and you think of Socrates' main theme or his great principle is virtue equals knowledge. That that virtue is a matter of knowing. It's not a moral quality. It's not that you're good or bad. It's whether you know or not. A person who's bad just doesn't know what is good. It isn't that he voluntarily wants to do something bad. And that's Socrates' famous statement, which is open to the obvious objection that it does seem that many people voluntarily know what's wrong and nonetheless do it. So when you're speaking of the rule of laws, which is what we began talking about in Trump versus U.S., you have to consider that behind the rule of law is the question of what causes people to disobey. And is it knowledge, or is it just a bad character, or a bad choice, or being bad?
Do you think Donald Trump or Joe Biden ever read Plato? Any evidence that they've read Aristotle, Socrates? You can't read Socrates, but
yeah. Well, with Trump, it doesn't seem that he reads at all. Maybe he had to read a book to get out of Wharton School where he went, but that's a business education. I don't know how much Plato is taught there.
One of the things that I picked up in your piece, and I wanted to mention and get your opinion on, everything's in it. Whether you agree with the conclusion or not, it's not the point, but you mentioned the U.S. Constitution, you mentioned the Declaration of Independence, you mentioned the Federalist Papers, and you mentioned democracy in America, and you, of course, I can't remember for sure whether you mentioned Machiavelli, but we know that you've written about him and talked about him. Which of those that I just listed do you think was well done, well written, and which maybe not so well done?
All those were well done, including Machiavelli. Machiavelli's in there, even though he's not named. Machiavelli is the one who defines politics as conspiracy, as secretive in nature. But no, all those people are very intelligent and are beautiful writers. The Federalist, too. The Federalist is just elegant. At the same time, it's clear. Often writers who are elegant aren't clear, and writers who are clear aren't elegant. But the Federalist combines the two. When you look at it, you say, that isn't the way people write now. And then after a while, you say, and it's a pity. Because the quality of that document or those papers, written very quickly, over a space of not quite a year, in 1787, 88. But it's utterly remarkable. The others are philosophers, say Machiavelli and Tocqueville and Aristotle, Plato. They're on a sort of higher plane. People ask me whether I'm a conservative, and say, yeah, my gods are higher in the sky than conservatism. And by that I mean the philosophers that I've learned from and that I've taught all my life, and which I specialized in. I specialized in a course running through the year that went from Plato to Nietzsche. Those are the highest human beings that have lived, or who have left records, writings, and each of them has his own way of expressing himself. But they talk to each other, and if you read them carefully, you see they comment on themselves, and it leaves you with an impression of a power which is human, but is way above. Those people are way smarter than I am. So I spent my life with smart students, but with teaching them to read books that were written by people who are much, much smarter than they are.
In the decision on July 1st, 2024 on immunity, and I read this paragraph because, again, I want you to tell us, where did this come from in the past in our lawmaking? And the six say, under our constitutional structure of separated powers, the nature of presidential power entitles the former president to absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for actions within his conclusive and preclusive constitutional authority. And he is entitled to at least presumptive immunity from prosecution for all his official acts. There is no immunity for unofficial acts. Where does all that come from that allows those six to write that and to make it the law now?
Well, what you quote is from my article, but it's also from the case, Trump versus in the majority opinion by John Roberts. So, this idea of immunity is an innovation. That's true. But as I try to argue, it's an innovation which is in the spirit of the Constitution. To repeat, the Constitution does mention legal prosecution that the president could be under for in addition to impeachment, but it mainly doesn't consider them. It considers how impeachment would be carried out. See, but so it's an innovation to speak of this immunity. It's different from what's, or at least it's not in the Constitution, and it's not in the Federalist that this immunity should occur. But I think it's in the spirit of it. So it's an example of a conservative court which is wants to restore the originalism of the Constitution, but also sees that it's necessary today to do something that's an innovation. And it's an innovation which matches another innovation, namely the prosecution of Trump by or very prosecutions in the plural of Trump, which hasn't been done before to a former president. As I say, we like to treat our former presidents as steeds who've done their job. They're old horses, and they deserve a rich and rewarding pasture to graze in, and they shouldn't be troubled by by acts which they can claim were authorized by their election as president.
Which of your books would you recommend somebody read that you think would give them the most background on this kind of stuff we're talking about?
Well, the book that I wrote on executive power, called "Taming the Prince," would probably be the one. I also have a book on called "The Constitutional Soul," which has articles about my views of the Constitution, and another book called "The Spirit of Liberalism" on the same point. But better to read Tocqueville and the Federalist. I can point you toward them, but you can also start from them as well.
The Federalist, as you know, most were written by either James Madison, and I'm blanking.
Alexander Hamilton.
Alexander Hamilton, thank you. Can you tell the difference when you read them, between them?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because which actually arose because when Hamilton died, he made a list of the ones that he wrote, and he was killed in a duel. He made this list the night before he was going to have the duel, and he made a list, and he included some that Madison thought that he wrote. And so the scholars tried to look at ways in which they wrote each of them, in order to make it find a way to distinguish the two. And it was it was very difficult, because you tried to go by the number of words in the sentence. For example, or little things that people do in their writing, which they may not be aware of, but which identifies them. And it turned out, this was a discovery by a single historian, that one of them used the word upon, and the other used the word on. So I've forgotten which. But it turned out that the answer was that Madison was right, and Hamilton had misremembered. And so, in other words, the two writers, and there was a third, of course, John Jay, who wrote 3 of the Federalist Papers, tried, I think, deliberately to write in the style of the pseudonym that they used, Publius. So in a way, Publius is the author of the Federalist. And it's true, it's very common to say Madison said this. Madison said in Federalist number 10, that's most famous Federalist paper of all, and that was written by Madison. And also in number 51 is another of the most famous ones. But in fact, you can find the things that Madison said in 10 and in 51 also in papers that were written by Hamilton. I think they each tried to be one fictional author and not to express themselves as individuals.
If you had to pick one founder that you would have liked to have been, who would it be?
Oh, well, there I'm in a quandary between Madison and Hamilton. So I'll say George Washington.
In your piece from the Journal, you mentioned Jack Smith. Yeah. And I bring up Jack Smith because, as you know, Judge Cannon down in Florida threw out the documents case based on the fact that Jack Smith, she said, was not legal as a special prosecutor. What's your take on that?
None. That's too much of a legal question for me. I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but I look at them from a political point of view. And so I would say that shows a certain hostility on the part of the judge to this kind of prosecution.
Factor in the immunity decision and give us your take on if Kamala Harris is elected or Donald Trump is elected, what will be the result of all that when it comes to the courts and these prosecutions?
I think that this case has put an end to prosecution of former presidents. It's going to be very hard to find a case that doesn't include an official act. Just the president would not have immunity for unofficial acts. It's hard to find unofficial acts that he might be prosecuted for. For example, not wearing a necktie, or wearing brown shoes with a gray suit, or let's go with a woman president, not wearing a pearl necklace. Questions like that are unofficial and sufficiently personal and harmless. But still, what is it that about a president that doesn't somehow touch on his official capacity?
Last question, and I'll let you go. Maybe two more. One, this is all delicate to ask somebody, but I'm not that far behind you. What's it like to survive with a clear brain until you're 92 years old?
I don't know. It's touch and go, let me tell you. So, when I wake up in the morning and stretch, I thank the Lord.
And last, why did you pick to be a professor of philosophy instead of political science?
No, I understand that what I do is political science. And that political philosophy is really the same thing as political science. Political science as practiced today is much narrower and more quantitative and concerned with smaller questions that I can't work up much interest in. And it also takes up things that are inherently difficult because they depend on predictions, on events which may or may not occur. So I would not be considered a political scientist by all political scientists today. But nonetheless, I had a place, and political theory, political philosophy still has a place in American universities in political science departments rather than in philosophy departments. The trouble with the philosophers is that they don't know anything about politics.
Professor Harvey Mansfield, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening to the Booknotes Plus podcast. Please rate and review Booknotes Plus, and don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.